Welcome, northeastern tree fruit workers. Listen in while experts discuss what's on their minds this week, the first week of May 2021. Apples are blooming in the Hudson Valley, as well as some early varieties in Massachusetts. Most of the rest of us are just about there and expect warm weather this week, so the conversation turned to Fireblight protection and how to use decision-making models to make choices for when and how often to get out there with strep applications. Blossom blight infections happen when wind, rain, and insects move the causal bacteria all around, and that bacteria lands on blossoms. A rain event washes those bacteria down into the flower, so we protect trees with antimicrobial products to prevent viable pathogens from creating these infections inside blooms. The extent of risk in your orchard depends on how much infection and therefore how much of those bacteria live in your orchard. There's a place in the NUA website where you can make adjustments based on your history of fireblight infection. Stay tuned for a longer conversation about the pros and cons of using Mary blight, Cougar blight, and RimPro models, as well as some other scenarios where fireblight infections are not so straightforward, like how to recognize other kinds of wetting events that can do the same thing that a rain event does, like high humidity or dew, or maybe even man-made wetting events like foliar sprays. Products like Regulate or LI 700 are often recommended for improving spray coverage. Please pay attention to the label and make sure to follow those rate recommendations, as there can be some phytotoxicity problems depending on the situation. For example, combining Regulate and Captan can cause some problems, so they should be separated by about 4 days. Stick around. About 17 minutes in, we discuss the pros and cons of various spreader stickers in different applications. If this is an area of interest for you, I highly recommend checking out the resources from Omafra's application technology specialist, Jason DeVoe, in the description below. The Sprayer 101 resources are terrific, and there's some very cool videos of spreader stickers in action. About 37 minutes in, we continue on the topic of sprayer application, but turn to the best time of day to make applications. Cooler temperatures in the evening may be helpful for avoiding drift, and evening is also a time for reduced pollinator activity. Evening time applications for insecticide and antibiotics would probably be beneficial to avoid UV degradation. Dave mentions a study from Virginia Tech's Keith Yoder where he found no difference in efficacy of fungicides depending on the time of day. Herbicides, on the other hand, would probably be best applied during high light and high heat conditions for the best efficacy. Thinking about pollinator protection and looking ahead to plum curculio management, we discuss about 40 minutes in how to handle thinning sprays and PC targeted sprays at petal fall, where there may be some overlap of trees with open blooms and trees with fruitlets that are at risk of PC oviposition. While we don't have solid recommendations, Altacor, that the active ingredient on that is chlorantraniliprole, is relatively safe for pollinators and rated okay for plum curculio. These diamides are limited in the number of applications you can make during any given season, so it might be better placed later on in the season if you're targeting codling moth or other leps. Some other approaches are discussed, so stay tuned for that discussion.
Apple scab obviously has been an issue, but probably of more interest to the Hudson Valley growers was a borderline Mary blight infection period for Fireblight. It was one of those where, as I said in an email to Mike and Dan Donahue, it could turn out to be a huge infection period or a total no-show. And I don't think we'll know for a few weeks because it was really warm, humid, wet conditions for a couple days, but we never quite got the heat accumulations that Mary blight would require, at least at the Hudson Valley lab. A little further south in Orange County they did, but barely. So it'll be interesting to see what evolves.
Well, let's talk about Fireblight. What are you telling people about what are you telling people about that potential infection period?
Well, I think what Dan Donahue put out, and I agreed, or I suggested some of it, was that they should have been, holding their fire as long as they could up until it started raining on Wednesday, and then spraying just ahead of that, or even, you know, Thursday morning, if there was time before the rains, in between the rains. My concern was with temperatures. I think we got up to 82 on Wednesday, and so a lot more flowers opened. If they sprayed Monday, Tuesday, those newly opened flowers wouldn't have been well protected. So the rationale for holding off as long as possible was to cover as many of those open flowers as possible, and still get the orchards that are at high risk, which would be any pears and certainly younger orchards. I say less than 8 years old, maybe with newer planting styles, they're settling down a little sooner, but there seems to be something about juvenility that makes trees particularly susceptible. So I think a lot of growers did put out strep. My impression is that they had the weather to do that on maybe even late Tuesday and into Wednesday. So we'll see.
Liz, did you want to share your thought model as far as how to think? Is that how you would explain it? Like, you're muted.
I'm not even sure what you want to call that, but I'm, not sure how deep in a picture you want to get into the inner workings of my head, but that's where we're going to go right now. So, I had been going through some old notes, and I came across this from one of our chats previously, right? And it was notes on talking about Fireblight. I think it was back in January. And I remember, I think it was Quan had said something to the effect of, we've got this 2-stage infection piece, right? You've got this heat accumulation, and then you've got the bacteria transferred into the nectaries. And there's a couple of different things that go into that. Something else that recently came up was talking about how possibly even just high relative humidity is sufficient to trigger a Fireblight infection. And, the idea that a spray application could trigger a infection. And then, of course, all of the other pieces that fold into what we think about with Fireblight, with the decision support systems and the various pieces that go into that. Cougar Blight, Mary Blight, Rimpro, when do you spray? What do you spray? How long is it going to last? All of that. So, welcome to the chaos that's my head. And this doesn't even cover everything, which is kind of why I wanted to bring it up to this group, because I really don't know a better group of people who have more strongly held and well-researched opinions on this sort of information. So one of the things I'd really love to dig into is this high relative humidity and the idea of a spray application triggering infection. Specifically, and I kind of mentioned this to Dan yesterday in an email, in my thought process is well, okay, so high relative humidity, but doesn't that just lead to creating dew? And we already know that dew causes infection. My other thought around the whole spray application thing is are you really, if it's hot and dry, you're not likely to necessarily be going in to make a spray application, right? If it's hot, dry with a rain event coming and it's in bloom, you're going to go in with strep with your spray. So really, I think one of the biggest things I'd like to hash out right now is what is the deal with these questionable event causes? You know what I'm saying?
Do you think we could take a step back and talk about wait, no, put it back up. Because
I just can't see you guys when it's up.
Oh yeah. So what I just want to take a step back and be let's walk through basically you were trying to distill an hour or 2 long hour conversation that we had when we thought about every single particular scenario. But the original question was should I spray strep or should I not spray strep? Was that the original question?
I think for that particular meeting, that was the original question. Should I? How long does it last?
And if you have a period of time where you have infection period after infection period after infection period, where's the best place to put that strep? Was that the other secondary question?
My notes weren't that thorough.
Do you remember?
Yeah, that was our situation. We had 4 days in a row. So it was trying to figure out where to time it, considering we still had flowers opening up, and we had the 24-hour kickback. So that was definitely our situation last year. And just to add on to that spray application part, we did have some spray applications go on during those couple of days where there wasn't rain, but we're doing a thinning experiment, so we did end up putting strep in along with our thinner just in case.
So with this little model, it looks like you're splitting up NUA and Rimpro and Mary Blight. Like, would any of those, like, does this help with like that, when to spray or not spray versus when to time those? Like, can we walk through that to help us make those decisions, or is this just kind of thinking about all like the other and sometimes why scenarios where you might have an infection where your model tells you don't?
Right. And so one of the things that we talked about not last time, but like back in January, was the conservative nature of things like cougar blight and Mary blight. And now I've hitched cougar blight to NUA because my understanding is that NUA runs cougar blight, right? So you can like put in your information, whatever, and then you get your feed, and then you have a link that says click here for the cougar blight whatever, and it shows you the numbers within the framework of like high, low, caution, whatever the output is.
Cougar
It also runs
NUA
Mary
gives you the cougar blight values right there
in the table, right? But then you can also, there's just like you can click to get the scab graph, you can click to get the Fireblight graph, and it shows you the same stuff from that table in a different format. Dave, it also runs Mary Blight?
Yeah, the second line.
It runs EIP.
Right, EIP, which is basically a Mary Blight function. So the EIP reading is, and you'll notice when cougar blight says high risk, Mary Blight often will not. They don't match up particularly well in terms of, excuse me, when they say high risk and so forth, or infection. Personally, I've never learned to use cougar blight very well, and so I sort of refrain from commenting on that. I've always liked Mary Blight better. I worked with Paul Steiner when he was developing that, and I have a pretty good understanding of how it works. But one of our cynical retired consultants in the Hudson Valley says, well, if you look at the data, and there's a published report on the statistics, which was way over my head, but he said, I do just as well flipping a coin and telling a grower when to spray, because Mary Blight has far too many false positives. It'll say there's an infection, nothing shows up in the field. So he said, I don't know why you guys are so excited about these models, because they don't work better than flipping a coin. And to some extent, I agree with him.
I think that's fairly true in terms of the cougar blight and the Mary Blight. It's really hard to validate, as I'm sure you know as well as any of us, the models as it relates to Fireblight, because it's how do you show it? How do you vet it? I'm partial to Rimpro. I think I feel like I have a better handle on its output and what it's saying. I struggle with some of the ways that NUA represents data, and especially as it relates to Fireblight, because as you just mentioned and pointed out, they have those two lines of one is cougar blight, one is Mary Blight, and they often don't agree, even if it's in the same processing the same information. So as far as the models go, I think that if I were to make a recommendation for Fireblight, it would be based off of Rimpro, not off of NUA. But I think one of the things that I really was more interested in delving into, because I think the spray action, I mean, it's here, in the model in Rimpro, when that flower cohort that's going up turns red, you need to make an application for that. You got 24 hours, get it on. Ditto here with the, when it shows a high risk, whichever one you're going to look at, make your choice. So I think that piece is fairly clear. I don't know.
Although I would generally not advise growers to spray using Mary Blight until you get a predicted infection period. So even though the recommendation and Paul Steiner's recommendation was spray at high risk, I think you end up with far too many applications that way. And so I generally would limit my recommendations to saying you're going to spray when it predicts an infection period, not just when it says high risk. Now the dilemma is obviously, as Faruque mentioned today, is windy as heck, and if you didn't get a strep spray on or this past potential infection period, it's not going to do much putting it out today. So we always have to integrate, wind conditions and spray conditions with recommendations, and that further complicates things.
For sure. And it's clearly already complicated.
I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to throw out. One is that 24-hour kickback, if you look around, what it actually says is 12 to 24 hours. And so the question is, under what conditions is it 12? And under what conditions is it 24? And if you're assuming 24, can you screw up if it was actually only 12?
I don't know the answer to that, Dan. My impression is that, and I can't say I have any data for this, but I think with good coverage and a spreader sticker, that if you're a little late, you may end up with a dead blossom cluster, but it won't spread because you can get enough strep taken up into the cluster leaves to slow things down. And a grower won't really notice that. So my hunch is, and it's only a hunch, that if a pathologist was looking for Fireblight, maybe you'd only get 12 hours of kickback. But if a grower is looking at it, they might say 24 because they wouldn't see those very slight infections that occur and then are arrested. That's just sort of my hunch about it. I think the dilemma with any post-infection spray, scab or Fireblight, is that coverage is really, really critical. And because, any follow-up wet isn't going to help. Now, I'm not sure that strep redistributes, and yet I sort of wonder, I don't know if anybody's looked at that, but certainly if you go out post-infection on a windy day like today, you're not going to get 24 hours of post-infection control because you're not going to hit a lot of the flowers.
The adjuvants, Regulate versus LI 700, and then also Regulate around a Captan spray. How many days between?
Again, I think it varies a lot depending on the condition of the foliage, the weather, and everything else. But in my mind, Regulate isn't as bad as oil. And I would say 3 to 4 days separation is usually okay. Although if you have a fresh Captan residue and no rain, I wouldn't mind following Regulate with Captan. I'm more concerned about Captan residue and then putting Regulate over it. But I don't have any experience. Concerning LI 700, one of the salesmen many years ago in the Hudson Valley told me that you can use 4 to 8 ounces, 4 ounces as a pH adjustment in the tank, 8 ounces as a pretty good spreader. If you want sticker activity, you have to get up to about a pint per 100 gallons. And if you want penetrant activity, you have to get up to 24 ounces to 32 ounces per 100 gallons to get penetrant activity. And I've extrapolated that to say penetrant activity similar to Regulate. Most growers are not going to put in that much. And, as soon as you get up to those real high rates, then all kinds of bad things can happen. And since the research was done with Regulate, I'm still more comfortable recommending Regulate. Now, a lot of growers like LI 700 because at 8 ounces per 100 gallons, which is the common rate in the Hudson Valley, it's much less expensive, but you're not buying the same activity either.
Well, gosh, I like the way that this is going. Can we talk more about these two things and why you would use them? Like, I know LI 700 is kind of tagged for being, it doesn't play well with others. Does anybody want to take a risk of comparing and contrasting these products, like what they do and what they shouldn't be used for? I mean, Dave kind of covered some of it.
Well, in terms of the chemicals, I think the spray book out of Ontario that Jason put together has a good chapter on the different kinds of materials. And then there's a folklore in terms of what works where. The traditional saying is from pathologists is that fungicides are formulated with adequate materials. You don't need to put anything in the tank. But in terms of Captan, for example, we know that it's not very stable if the pH gets above 7. And rather than testing water all the time, throwing in a few ounces of LI 700 or a similar product, other companies make similar products, it sort of guarantees that you're not going to have alkaline hydrolysis occurring in your spray tank. And it does spread the product. If you look at the leaves after you spray with an air blast, you just have a much more uniform deposition. As you get into summer, if you're spraying a product that has leaves visible residues, it can actually create a blotchiness on the fruit because the spray deposits will interfere with color formation. Putting a spreader, LI 700 or something else in the tank at a low rate will even out that deposition, so you don't get the sort of blotchy color formation on fruit. When you go to something like Regulate or a real sticker, it can be a disadvantage. There's published reports that show that with apple scab, you don't want to stick that product on too much or it won't redistribute and rain to new leaves. So there's a negative side to, so when I think of stickers, I can't remember the name, but there's one that's made, well, I think it was one called Bond that is made by the same company that sells LI 700. There's a couple in there, and they're known to hold the product in place but limit redistribution. And so,
well, I see Jason's got his camera on, so we've got his attention on this one. Do you want to weigh in, Jason?
Everything David said was bang on in my limited experience. We worked with a deposition modifier in Canada. They're called DUMs, D-U-M, Deposition Utility Modifiers, which is ironic. And we did it in orchards. These would have been some of the last standard orchards in Ontario. And the operator I was working with was a dyed-in-the-wool alternate row applicator. So I slapped those people around at every opportunity unless they can prove it works. And we tried the deposition utility modifier, and it was stunning. We never got a single drop through the halfway mark on the tree. And then when we went with straight water, we were so convinced we had screwed up the application, a rate or the driving speed or something, that we did it again. And it was night and day. David's absolutely right. The stickers really work. There's no spread. There's no secondary deposition. There's no ricochets or bounces. When it hits, it hits. And there's no indication of that on a lot of the adjuvant labels. The US has a more open opinion about adjuvants. You can sell them, and there's a lot of buyer beware. We have to have them registered in Canada, and there's got to be a lot of information provided on the label before an operator can use them. And if I'm 100% representing the law, we're not supposed to tank mix adjuvants unless the label actually asks for it. The risks are big. If too much is used, products will get taken up or not get taken up in ways that the operator isn't expecting. We all know that. The idea that, and I used to parrot this, don't add adjuvants because the registrant has formulated the product with sufficient adjuvant to do the following. It'll mix better, it'll hydrate better, it'll distribute correctly on the target. If there's any reason to have the stuff not drift, they'll mix it in, it's shelf stable, et cetera, et cetera. But David Mangtelo gave me a different view on this, and it was just coffee talk, and I loved it. He said, okay, I've heard you say that the variability in spraying is gigantic. Yes. Does it not stand to reason that our limited number of adjuvants that are added to the products, that the registrant doesn't want to waste money by adding additional things if they don't have to? Okay. Does it not stand to reason that if they add too much of a particular adjuvant, it may defeat any of the other parameters that an adjuvant's supposed to do? Yeah. Does it stand to reason that given all the variability in droplet size and wind and operator ability and targets, that maybe there are situations where a little more is warranted? Yeah, logically, probably yes. Am I the guy that wants to add an extra ounce per acre until I hit the limit? Hell no, there aren't enough hours in the day, and the variables are just too many to control. I will say this, I maintain the whole buyer beware aspect. If someone says somebody stopped by the farm and said, chuck this in the tank, show me what happened when you did it in conditions similar to yours, with equipment similar to yours, in a crop similar to yours. Like if it's a physical deposition thing, I have some latitude. If it's water quality, like pH, the way David said, then yeah, Cat10, you get to alkaline, you down to minutes instead of hours. So, and we learned that pretty quickly. So those aren't secrets. But when it comes to things like improving efficacy or maybe rain fastness, there are a lot of secondary effects that we have to be aware of. So that deposition utility modifier experiment I did years ago showed me that, it's a two-edged knife. It can be good if you wanted to stick. It really worked, but it can be bad if you're expecting it to go further into the canopy or spread. Along those lines, we did play with LI 700 and a couple of products that were intended for field crops. They're all built for field crop sprayers first, and then they try to expand the market into air blast. And what we found was, and what we suspect happened, is that the phenomenal agitation in an air blast sprayer, the churn, which is considerably more than what you'll find in a field sprayer, actually either broke down or was sufficient to stop the product from working as expected. So I did this with a turbo mist, which is just a standard low profile sprayer. And I did it with a hall sprayer, a tower sprayer, and I tried it with air shear. And I didn't see any damn difference between what these anti-drift products were intended to do for an air blast sprayer with or without water. Now, admittedly, that was with water-sensitive paper, and we all know it's very variable. But I mean, I didn't see any difference at all. I maintain that if you're using adjuvants for drift, it's your air that's absolutely critical. If you have any control over droplet size, that might be secondary, but it's air and the conditions you spray in that will always mitigate drift. Dropping products in the tank for that is a fool's errand in air blast, in my opinion. Deposition, changing deposition, absolutely. It can work really well. I don't know about rain fastness, but I suspect. And I wouldn't do anything that anyone suggested unless they could prove to me that they had some experience with it and it worked.
Yeah.
So very long-winded response, but it's not an easy question, and it doesn't have a pat answer. If it did, then the agrochemical companies would have run these tests, and you would have a list of instructions on how these products work. I've never seen one.
Well, do you mind if I pose a more specific question? Because obviously we had a really good example of where you would want this material to move around and you wouldn't want it to stick, where you're getting the best foliar coverage you can to protect from fungal infections. What are some scenarios where you would want that? Like I would imagine most insecticide use, you would want that spreader sticker. Like are we fighting like an entomologist pathologist battle here, or?
I don't think so. I think you can split hairs and say if the product is a contact product and your target is something that doesn't move, then obviously we would want a little more coverage. And there are two ways to do that: mechanically, by using more volume or more droplets, or chemically, by having the chemical spread over the leaf. I can't think of any situation where more coverage isn't a good thing. It may be you don't need it, but I can't think of a situation where it would hurt you. Some of the most compelling adjuvants I've ever seen are the organosilicones, the super spreaders. And if anyone's ever seen these videos, like, your instant response is, oh my God, why don't we have this in every single tank? There's some beautiful work that came out of, I want to say New Zealand, it might have been Australia, where they used UV dye in the organosilicone. and they sprayed it on grape. And it didn't matter that it was a craggy surface or was covered in trichomes. As long as there was enough humidity in the air to keep the spray wet from drying, we watched as these droplets just crawled over the surface. Not only that, they wrapped around the outside edge of the leaf. And when they flipped the leaf, it had gotten like 2/3 past the margin. Like it looked like some kind of creeping death. I couldn't believe it. And I saw it on crop after crop after crop.
Hey,
So,
I see that Faruque turned his camera on, so maybe he has something to add. But I'm wondering, does anybody know anybody who's using his organosilicone spreaders?
well, just a quick warning, it also tended to creep in past the guard cells into the stomata and carry a very, very dangerous dose into the leaves. So that was the real catch in this. Just because you did spread the coverage, a much higher dose than was ever anticipated got into the apoplast of the leaf and ended up being delivered in a way that was never intended and became completely phytotoxic.
So this isn't a product that's on the market?
Oh yeah, for sure it is.
What is it used for?
Retain specifically calls for an organosilicone surfactant.
So I've heard, and I don't know that I've seen it documented in published literature, that you can actually reduce residues of things like mancozeb because the organosilicon spreaders will cause more runoff. So the leaf won't retain as much residue if there's enough water supplied so that the droplets coalesce and it actually drips off the leaves. It's sort of
there were two sides to that story. Absolutely right. The moment you add a little organosilicone, it's like you've doubled your spray volume. Like it runs like water off wax paper. What's really neat is if you get it just right, it's also got a higher cohesion. So a drip that's about to come off a fruit, you can watch it get drawn right back up so you don't get the drip points. So when everyone does the residue tests on, say, apples, depending on where they do the wipe, if you catch a drip point at the bottom, you could get a much higher residue level than, say, if you were up around the top of the apple. So it's also murky. I can never get a straight answer on it. But what I do take away from your runoff comment is, yes, and this is something David warned me about, it runs like mad if you get the volume too high. On the other hand, it does tend to, if you get it right, draw excess liquid back up over surfaces and tend to give a more a balanced dose along the entire surface. But wow, is that ever fine tuning?
I'd just throw another wrench into this mix, and that is many years ago, we were looking at an orchard where the grower ended up having a little bit of scab coming through on Gala. He had adjacent Macintosh type cultivars that were more susceptible to scab, but weren't showing any scab. To make a long story short, he was seeing the beginning of DMI resistance. He'd been using Rubigan, and he was spraying the entire orchard the same way. And my interpretation, I don't know if I'm correct, but I think it was correct, was that the Gala leaf has very few leaf hairs. It's not as absorbent. And so he was getting, his product wasn't being absorbed as well into the Gala leaf as compared to the Macintosh. And as a result, we saw the first DMI resistant scab showing up on a cultivar that was considerably more resistant, in my opinion, than Macintosh, but Macintosh was absorbing the product. Now, if you add to that the effect of spreaders and stickers, I'm just saying cultivar has an effect here as well. If you're spraying pear leaves, which are really hard to get things into, you may want to do something different than you do spraying Macintosh leaves.
Erping Zhu had these awesome slow-mo videos of controlled droplet application to hairy leaves. He's a big advocate for adding a little extra to the tank. And I watched as tiny droplets got caught up on the trichomes, and there was enough distance, like it just never touched the surface. It's big on cucurbits. So you'll get this frosty sort of impression on leaves if you're using fine droplets that have high cohesion. It's really cool. They look like little beads on top of the trichomes. And that's where they slowly evaporate and leave their residue right in place. You add just a little bit of something to break down that cohesion, and it ran right down the trichome and spread over the surface. Really compelling stuff. But
Jason, can you can you share any kind of resource that would be the best thing to share along this line, or like some of these pictures that you're talking about? And
I can, and they're on Sprayers 101.
Okay.
But, it's buried, so I understand.
Maybe just like,
Here's a few bullets.
Yeah,
You can add a little extra to the tank without worry of like that whole idea that the registrant put the right amount in.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily. There is a case to be made that if you're having a particular problem, a little more might help. Recognize there are a lot of other effects beyond the one you're looking for. It may create a phytotoxic effect. It can incur runoff. On the other hand, if it's a sticker, you may not get the deposition you were hoping for, and water-sensitive paper may not help you here.
Yeah.
The surface is just too different.
So what I'm thinking of is like when we're trying to answer questions from our growers, like obviously I'm not going out there with water sensitive paper. I'm kind of dealing with like how to help them interpret what their chemical guy is telling them.
Ask for proof. Show me the numbers.
That's
like,
honestly a good takeaway.
If anyone wants a really awesome demo that would at least open somebody up to the possibility that adjuvants do more than you expect and to be respectful of them, you can buy these 51 LED handheld black flashlights for $20. So in American, like $3. And you can buy non-toxic children's UV face paint. For all of you who have been to a rave lately, I'm sure you've seen it, but it's also from Crayola and completely, innocent stuff. It doesn't have an MSDS. I wouldn't drink it, but it won't hurt anything. You get a few spray bottles. We did this with fuzzy almond nuts, which is fun. And you have growers spray leaves. We did cabbage leaves. We did all kinds of leaves you'd expect. And then they hit them with this black light, even in full daylight. And you can see instantly how the spray spread or how it dripped or how it, annealed just with little handheld spray bottles. And you don't have to have an objective except to say, don't just throw shit in there willy-nilly. Look at the differences it can have. And do you know whether what you're seeing is going to be a good thing or a bad thing? Because we don't. So, caveat emptor, just beware when you're being thrown a pitch, not to just chuck it in because it's only an extra $1 an acre.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to put a pin in that conversation. But I will say that those UV flashlights, I've purchased them before, and they come with very long forceps for pulling hornworms off of tomato plants. That's how they market them.
Yeah, well, I've seen them marketed for scorpions and nasty biological stains in hotel rooms. Don't ever shove one in there. You don't want to know.
We could have stopped with hornworms and forceps on that one.
What else are we looking at this week? Do we have any New English oddities to talk about, or insect things on the docket that you wanted to talk about?
Can I ask the group a question? I don't have an answer for this. I'm curious your thoughts. Whenever we talk about drifting, whenever we're trying to find a spray window, I have a habit of telling growers, don't spray too early in the morning because odds are you're in the middle of a thermal inversion and the finest part of your spray will stay, in a calm condition, suspended for hours and hours and hours until the wind picks up and takes it, wherever. So they say, all right, when do I spray? Well, avoid the late evenings because that's when inversions are setting up, and avoid very early mornings because that's when they haven't broken down enough. Well, what about pollinator activity? This window you're describing tends to land right on pollinator activity. And while obviously we don't want to spray active pollinators, if you do spray any of these products during an inversion, it has the potential to travel for miles. And odds are it's going to end up on a lot of other pollen sources. It's going to end up in places you never intended. I just wonder what the least evil is in this. I have no answer. Maybe the dose is so small from inversion drift that it's not worth mentioning. Anyone ever heard of this?
Well, a lot of the new U.S. labels say apply only with wind speeds between 2 and 8 miles per hour, which means that applying it in absolutely calm weather is a violation of label. I think everybody's ignoring that, but it is on a lot of the labels.
I have another question though, especially if you're looking at maybe that plum curculio window, which is, you know, later than right now, like it's maybe too early in the season to start thinking about it. But like, what else are you going out there with? Like, especially if you're thinking about best coverage for, say, like a foliar fungicide versus an insecticide that's supposed to be protecting fruit. Like, we always think insecticides are best applied in the evening, you know, as far as getting away from pollinators, and because, you know, a lot of insects tend to be active that time of day. Does that counteract what you'd be doing for anything else you'd be applying in the orchard that time of year for plum curculio?
I can't think of anything.
Now, Keith Yoder did an extended multi-year study, I believe, looking at the advantage of applying certain fungicides in early evening as compared to early morning, and he never really found any significant effects with the fungicides. I don't think that the time of day has much effect. With the antibiotics, there may be an advantage to spraying evenings because they break down in sunlight. So for fireblight control, you might have a little more time for uptake if you spray it when there's not direct sunlight. Other than that, I can't think of any plant pathology reason to spray at a certain time of day.
David, with herbicides, often we'll tell people to spray certain products in the heat when the plant is actively photosynthesizing because the uptake's better. Can you think of any systemic product that, you know, we want full photosynthesis when we put it on? I've never thought of one for fruit crops.
I can't think of any fungicides, and I'm not sure that the uptake mechanism for the herbicides and the fungicides would be the same. I really don't know.
No, I don't think they are. I was just curious if there was any, even a local systemic product where it might help. But I can't think of any off the top of my head. I don't even remember seeing one in our Pub 360, our Ontario production guide.
I think some of the herbicides like Ramoxone are activated by sunlight, and you know, if you apply it in the dark, it won't kill anything. So it does. I think there you're looking at a chemical reaction. You need active photosynthesis, and that certainly may be true for some of the growth regulators as well. I don't know, John, if you have an opinion on applying thinners in the evening compared to early morning.
I'm not aware of any issues. No. I mean, you think if you applied paraquat when it's dark, it wouldn't work, period?
It doesn't.
It doesn't work.
If the plants are never exposed to light.
Well, I mean, what if it gets light the next day?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But
they've shown it has less of an effect than it would if you sprayed right there and then, but it does still work eventually.
I got a question for you guys. So the past, we typically use carbaryl for thinning. So this whole bee issue is a real, I don't know. You know, first of all, if we're spraying at petal fall, the bees should be out of the orchard. All the dandelions should be either mowed or killed with a fall herbicide. So there should be no pollinators in the orchard. So we're gonna spray carbaryl for thinning. That's a pretty common practice. And then, I mean, Imidan is still the cheap, well, I don't know how cheap it is now, but relatively cheap and effective option for curculio. So you tell me what the problem is.
I think Jaime was bringing it up for mixed blocks where you had like where growers had trees that were at risk for oviposition scars from plum curculio, but they also had trees that weren't quite done with bloom at the same time.
Yeah, well, that is a problem, but all I can say is it seems to me that if stuff's still in bloom, you should not be spraying any insecticide, period.
Right.
Yeah, but that's how we always wind up getting into trouble with plum curculio challenges throughout a given year, because petal fall, first of all, you do have those mixed blocks. And second of all, you know, everybody trying to pin down petal fall is...
Curculio is not a problem. It's not a problem until the fruit reach like 6-7 millimeters.
And yet...
what is a problem with curculio, at least in the Hudson Valley, are cultivars like Liberty and a few others that tend to size very rapidly after petal fall. And so they become very attractive to curculio while Gala still has a lot of secondary bloom on the 1-year-old wood. If we could get cultivars that don't produce bloom on 1-year-old wood, we'd be a lot better off.
So let's use Liberty as a trap tree.
So, John, we see like you said that half inches or quarter inches of the fruit, we see that, but the damage happened much earlier, and we have seen as much as 80% fruit was damaged by plum curculio in a 20 acres field. So it's too late.
Well, you know, Ron Prokopi always used to say, and he certainly studied plum curculio pretty extensively, that the risk of fruit damage is really not great till about 6-7 millimeters. It could have changed in 20 years. I'm not saying it didn't. I'm just saying that's what I still go by.
But 6 to 7 millimeters isn't going to be the same across a block or an orchard.
No, so you got to go spray them separately.
I think that's where the problem lies.
No, I don't agree. That's a problem, but I still say I'm not so sure you should be spraying any insecticide, period, when stuff's in bloom and bees are foraging.
I will point out that Dan put pesticiderisk.org in the chat. Is that something you'd recommend? Or is he still on the call? I was going to say, has anybody used that resource before, and was it helpful? Just a synopsis as far as the input that we got from folks outside of the Northeast about whether or not to use diamides for some of these iffy periods where like you don't think you're going to have time to come in and treat those different trees differently. Most of the response was like, why would you waste a diamide on plum curculio? Like, these are great LEP products and don't waste them.
That's
and we were like, well, our situation might be a little different here than it was, that down in the mid-Atlantic. So the take home there would be more like, if LEPs are your problem, use the diamides for LEPs. Kathleen, you turned your camera on. Do you have something to say?
Yeah, I just, I think that Ron's approach with curculio was, and I would say that I would hold by that. I've never seen curculio damage fruit that was less than that 6 or 7 millimeter size. And that basically the carbaryl that you use for thinning, when you put that on, that's going to kind of hold back the first wave of curculio, and you don't really get a massive influx of curculio until you get, a fair number of the fruit in the orchard getting to that 6 or 7 millimeter stage, and that's when you go in with your, serious curculio materials. For what that's worth.
Just to jump in on the fruit measurements and timing, I think in one of our recent meetings, we kind of went around the room and asked, when do you put that petal fall thinning application on? And do we come up with a size that we liked? Was it sort of that 4 to 5 millimeters or 5 to 6, somewhere in that window, John? Do you remember?
I don't think we resolved it, but I mean, if you want depends who you ask.
Right.
Dwayne Green says petal falls when the bees are out of the orchard. I say petal falls when 100% of the petals are off.
Right. You read I think an Amethyst label, and it might say when 90% of the kings have fallen off, or it's so there's certainly, I think that's another part of the equation.
Applying a thinner though is not a problem during bloom while there's still flowers. It's when you're using carbaryl as a thinner that's the problem, because
it's just carbaryl. Yeah.
Yep.
So the concentration of carbaryl for thinning versus the controlling plum curculio is not in a big difference. The thinning purpose, you use very low rate compared to the plum curculio control rate. So is that works the same rate?
Well, that's a good question. You're probably correct. Maybe on these smaller trees, a quart per acre would give you some plum curculio control. But again, Ron said, there's not typically the feeding damage is not that, or egg laying damage is not that high during that period. So it gives you just enough protection to get you through to 6, 7, 8 millimeters in that first night when PC become real active. Then you need as Kathleen said, the more effective PC sprays.
Peter Yench and Dick Straub did some work looking at that low rate of carbaryl, and in one year it looked very good, and the next year the low rate was not adequate. So I think it depends on a lot of environmental factors, and you know, some under low pressure, I think the low rate may be adequate, but I wouldn't trust it in the Hudson Valley. I might add that many years ago, Rick Wires, who was the entomologist at the lab, ran some trials and showed some benefit on minimizing curculio damage by applying a pink spray when you couldn't get back in, you know, with mixed cultivars, you didn't want to come with an insecticide, and you had a rapid heat wave that sized fruit. He was getting some benefit from a pink spray on both curculio and sawfly. The IPM people in New York didn't want to hear anything about it, and it was sort of a real point of contention between Hudson Valley growers and upstate growers, where I don't think that was necessarily true. I'm not sure anybody's applying a pink spray that in a long drawn out period. I'm not sure it does much good, but in a fairly quick bloom period, I think some of the residues, particularly of the back then they were using even glutathione or imidan at pink, were having some carryover effects.
So Dave, yesterday me and my assistant was in the apple orchard for plum curculio monitoring. We did some beating trace samplings. There is no plum curculio. The orchard is in pink. Actually, they are not there. So each year we do some sampling. We never see plum curculio on apple trees at pink. Mostly it starts at 50% bloom period to the flower.
Right,
but I don't know that what will be the target if we do a pink spray.
Yeah, because what's bringing them into the orchard, right?
Well, the advantage was having the residue there, not that the curculio were there when it was applied, but that the residues were still active when they started migrating in.
And then once they're in the orchard, they're crawling around a lot, so they're going to encounter that residue. And that's that's what some of the growers that I work with that have early varieties that are just a chronic curculio, trap, that they would do a pink spray and go ahead with get those varieties just on the early varieties, get those covered pre-bloom, and then give you a little more leisure on the other end of that.